Shirley, I'd like to ask you, in your book, Out on a Limb,
Yeah.
you said the phrase, I am God. What did you mean?
Well, church lady, you see, I believe that God is within everyone. I believe that you are God, the cameraman is God, and by that same token, you see, I am God.
Well, isn't that special? Shirley, I'm sorry, but I don't think the Heavenly Father is a sassy little redhead.
Come on, that's not what I mean, and you know that. You know, church lady, you and I are actually very similar in our beliefs. Actually, I believe that Jesus and Buddha and Muhammad were all great spiritual leaders.
So you give Muhammad and Buddha equal billing with Jesus. Well, who helped you with your little ideas, Shirley? Who could it be? Oh, I don't know. Satan?
Happy hair season, welcome to the desert of the real. And it is a desert, a vast and endless desert. As the clip alludes to, we are traveling this desert. On one side, orthodoxy, telling us to bow down to rules and dogma and storm gods. On the other side, we got wispy but extroverted spirituality, assuring us we can become gods as long as we purchase a lot of merch and turn our backs against any sort of moral fortitude, ontological iniquity, or sober reasoning.
I wish that I could bake a cake made out of rainbows and smiles, and we'd all eat it, be happy.
She doesn't even go here.
Do you even go to this school?
No, I just have a lot of feelings.
Both lead us to sacrificing our true self at the altar of the average to bring about an age of narcissism. And the atheist forces at our heels gently urge us to do this too, for there is no meaning in anything, and a meat sack dream is all that matters.
The only true God, the only real God, is the God of meat.
But we continue in the desert of the real, knowing that this age of narcissism is already here. Knowing, too, that the middle path is the most perilous one, for if we're not careful, we can be swept away by sandstorms of neo-Gnosticism and weaponized Gnosticism that can give us the world but lose our souls, as the Gospel of Mark says. Oh, it's perilous. But we continue forward because we're waking up, which only means we're finally ready to let go of everything our programming told us was valuable and see the world for what it is.
All kinds of ghettos in the world.
It's all one ghetto, man. Giant gutter in outer space.
As the recently departed and true friend of the Gnostic, Harold Bloom, once wrote in Omens of the Millennium, when we crash down into this world made by the inept angels, then God crashed also, coming down not with us, but in some stranger sphere, impossibly remote. In those waste places, God now wanders, himself an alien, a stranger, an exile, even as we wander here.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
You jumped up a notch.
Farewell, good professor. You will not be forgotten. And welcome you, O you veterans of 1,000 psychic wars. Welcome with me in the desert of the real, where you will find your beauty and those infinite things. Even as orthodoxy and New Age attack you at each side. Even if materialism tells you you're just a sex bot for the vagaries of fate and pleasure. Even as you worry that you won't transcend time and space, but instead manipulate both when you find the secrets of the neo-Gnostics. We're in this together, and I, your host, Miguel Connor, are here with you every painful step of the way. But we're fine, you see, for half of the battle is waking up, while the other half is, yes, writing our own gospel and living our own myth.
What unites people? Armies? Gold? Flags? Stories? There's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story. Nothing can stop it. No enemy can defeat it. And who has a better story?
They call us dualists. Ha! But look at the reality around. An entire universe of manufactured polarities. Did you know, as ex-Mossad and academic Sam Vanking pointed out, the path of serial killers during their murder sprees is the same path as bees looking to pollinate flowers? Duality is sewn into the fabric of the fucking cosmos, and only the Gnostic sees and navigates this kismet.
The earth is evil. We don't need to grieve for it. Nobody will miss it. All I know is life on earth is evil. How do you know? Because I know things.
Astral guests have done a pleromic task in providing clear ways out of the desert of the real. New ways to experience the galaxy and innovative ways to see the world. Our astral guest in this eternal now is no different. We are honored to have Erin Prophet incarnate at the virtual Alexandria.
This is awe-inspiring stuff.
I've met Erin twice at the Gnostic conferences at Rice University, and she is a true seeker warrior of the highest caliber. Erin is author of Prophet's Daughter, My Life with Elizabeth Clare Prophet Inside the Church Universal and Triumphant, and Reincarnation, the Missing Link in Christianity. She is a visiting assistant professor at the University of Florida, where she teaches about cults and new religious movements, nature and the environment, and spirituality and health. Erin will be discussing those forces I've been talking about, Orthodoxy and New Age, as well as modern esoteric religions, including neo-Gnosticism and weaponized Gnosticism, in cults and in general. All topics she has both experienced directly and researched passionately as a keen scholar.
Following these faiths, based on mythological figures, ensures the destruction of one's inner being. Organized religion destroys who we are by inhibiting our actions, by inhibiting our decisions, out of fear of some intangible parent figure who shakes a finger at us from thousands of years ago and says, do it and I'll fucking spank you.
Like Erin and her own journey, we continue that perilous middle path in the desert of the real, waking up and finding who we really are. And then all those foes and movements cannot touch us, but we can touch them to understand their essence and even usefulness. All to help heal this age of narcissism and break all those dualities.
Believe me, the sooner we're off the planet, the better.
By Crom, I myself have benefited from New Age and Orthodox metaphysics. Like the prophet Mani said, there is light trapped in everything. It's everywhere around us. I have enjoyed Eckhart Tolle, Tony Robbins, or Richard Bach, as I have enjoyed old-time gospel music and worshiping in a Shiite mosque.
May Allah smile upon you always.
perhaps my favorite New Age or self-help book is Awareness, The Perils and Opportunities of Reality by Anthony DeMello. DeMello was an Indian Jesuit priest and psychotherapist who eventually became a heretic with the church because, well, he started spouting some rather Gnostic ideas. The book was recommended to me by some gang member when I was in rehab in Houston for cocaine addiction, sometime at the turn of the millennium. The book changed my life, and, like Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, it's more than a read but an experience. It will take lifetimes before I encounter a soul like DeMello's. Thus and thusly, we end with the words of Anthony DeMello in Awareness.
Spirituality means waking up. Most people, even though they don't know it, are asleep. They're born asleep. They live asleep. They marry in their sleep. They breed children in their sleep. And they die in their sleep without ever waking up. They never understand the loveliness and the beauty of this thing that we call human existence. You know, all mystics, they're all unanimous on one thing, and that one thing is, all is well. All is well. Everything's in a mess, and all is well. Strange paradox. But tragically, most people never get to see that. They never get to see that all is well because they're asleep. They're in a nightmare. Most people tell you that they want to get out of kindergarten, but don't believe them. Don't believe them. All they want for you to do is to mend their broken toys. Give me back my wife. Give me back my job. Give me back my money. Give me back my reputation, my success. This is what they want. They want their toys repaired. That's all. Now, even the best psychologists will tell you that. They'll tell you people don't really want to be cured. What they want is relief. A cure is painful. Waking up is unpleasant, you know. You're nice and comfortable in bed, and at least as long as you're asleep, it's irritating to be woken up. That's the reason why I told you the wise guru will not attempt to wake people up. I hope I'm going to be wise these days and make no attempt whatsoever to wake you up if you're asleep. None of my business. My business is to do my thing, to dance my dance. If you profit from it, fine. If you don't, too bad. As the Arabs say, the nature of the rain is the same, but it grows thorns in the marshes and flowers in the garden.
This is the Aeon Bite interview, and with us, we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Erin Prophet. How you doing, Erin? So glad to have you on the show.
Just great, Miguel. Thanks a lot for having me.
I think it's overdue having you on as we discuss at the Gnostic America Conference, and we can unpack that and so much more. And also with us, we've got the Moondog, Vance Sachi. How you doing, Vance?
I'm fine. I just spent the afternoon learning about you, Erin. So this should be very interesting. I watched your video on your website and all sorts of stuff. Very, very good stuff. We're looking forward to this.
Super cool.
Yes, indeed. And even before we met at the Gnostic America Conference, we did meet 2 years previously at the Gnostic Counterculture Conference, both held at Rice University. And it was a pleasure meeting with you, interacting with you both times. I enjoyed your paper at the Gnostic America Conference. And I was thinking, how do we start this? Obviously, sometimes I ask individuals, how did you get into the esoterica? But you're the one person that we don't even have to ask that, because you were born into the esoterica as soon as you came out of the womb. But so I wanted to move a little bit further down and find out why exactly did you decide to, and of course this sort of gives a little promo to our friends at Rice University and the wonderful GEM program, but why did you pursue your doctorate at Rice University?
Well, I think that I pretty much knew I wanted to get a doctorate in religious studies since the 1990s. Really, my mother had been teaching on Gnostic Gospels since the 80s. When I was a teenager, she was reading Elaine Pagels, but of course her work and my father's work were informed from the beginning by Theosophy, which of course was one of the first popularizers of Gnosticism and of the idea that Gnosticism was this sort of secret, suppressed, hidden wisdom that was at the foundation of all the world's religions. And that was sort of the true teachings that had been lost. And this narrative, my parents picked up from Helena Blavatsky, and they developed a significant following around the world as sort of promoters of, you might say, neo-Gnostic theology. So it was very important to me to try to understand, because I started reading some of the Gnostic Gospels, and when Marvin Meyer's The Secret Gospels came out, I think it's sometime in the 90s, and I was thinking, these texts don't seem to agree with one another completely, and there seemed to be different voices there, and I became very curious about how they had how they had interacted, and was there really a complete system there, or were they looking for systems, and what were all these other systems they were talking about, and how did Plato fit into the mix? And so it just took me some time. It wasn't until 2012 that I actually was able to begin my PhD studies, and I was just thrilled to find a PhD program that allowed me to focus on Gnosticism in the contemporary context. I didn't end up studying Coptic, although I did take a couple of seminars with April de Koning. And the interesting thing is, I had actually met April in 1995, because when she had published one of her first papers about the Valentinians, Seek to See Him, I think it was called. And I was doing research for a book on reincarnation in Christianity that I was writing with my mother at the time. And again, I was trying to learn more about the roots of these ideas. And April certainly had a fresh and accessible take on them that sort of started me on my quest and my readings. And so I was fortunate enough to study with her and Jeff Kripal, and I completed my doctorate in 2018. And now I am a professor, visiting assistant professor at the University of Florida.
Awesome. And well, you talked about Gnosticism in modern times. We want to unpack that as well. But at the conference, at the Gnostic America Conference, there were so many good insights. And I don't know if you were there for Eric Davis's paper, but or it was around there. But I remember him standing up. And this is something I also asked Matthew Dillon, who was a colleague of yours, and in a past interview. But Eric Davis basically said, what separates Gnosticism from perennialism are the Archons. Do you remember that, or what do you think about this? I think it has merit. I mean, there's that dualism and ontological darkness that the Gnostics have that other movements don't want to touch or kind of like dance around. What do you think?
Well, I think that there's a lot of truth in that, and I've been kind of mulling over this question, and during the conference, it seemed to me, and I actually was sort of dividing my paper into two sides, because you had papers that were focusing on the side of Gnosticism that is interested in, divinization, personal transcendence, rituals of self-transformation, theurgy, and things like that. And then you have the side of Gnosticism that focuses more on the evil demiurge and the idea that the world was not created, that Jehovah, Yahweh, or Yaldabaoth, as it's called in Gnostic texts, was an evil creator god, and that the purpose of life is to sort of escape from the world and the Archons. So there certainly were elements of both types of belief in my parents' interpretation of Gnosticism. But I also think that, a person's Gnosticism is really only as good as where they've learned about it from. And I mean, we had our paper on Borges' Gnosticism. Borges' approach to Gnosticism was heavily influenced by Hans Jonas, and so many people, my parents, Blavatsky was reading Pistis Sophia, and there certainly is a lot of sort of against the world, a lot of notion that this world is passing thing, that we should not be attached to it, and in Theosophy, and also in A Course in Miracles, for example, and some of these other systems that were influenced by it. But they don't get as far off into the Archons and the evil as some other groups do, like Discordians, or maybe some of the ones that Eric might have been talking about. So I think that ancient Gnosticism was probably about as diverse as modern Gnosticism, and I ended up deciding after the conference was over that it was difficult. I mean, for example, we had Greg Shaw's paper about Emerson and the Iamblichus and Neoplatonism,
right?
And he was sort of arguing that the focus should be on the divine within, and everyone sort of cultivating their divine qualities in a much more sort of friendly to this world mentality. So I think that, my paper was looking at Hermeticism, and I think that Hermeticism is one of those ancient systems that was perhaps a little more friendly to the created world than some of the others. And I know that a lot of people don't necessarily even consider Hermeticism to be Gnostic at all. So we could talk about that.
I would say they are. I mean, for example, I was reading Corpus Hermeticum, I think it was chapter 16, and it talks about the universe being full of evil spirits and watch out. And you read other parts and it talks about how we are trapped in this body and we got to tear off the flesh and go back and all that. So, I mean, I would say so. What do you think, Erin?
Well, I think that
it can be debated, I guess.
I think that it would be also a mistake to view the Corpus Hermeticum as a single corpus, and it's come down to us. These texts have been grouped together, and we know that different people took different Hermetic ideas in different directions. But I mean, I think you could say that all of it. I think the unique thing about Hermeticism is that evil as the world may be, it's still a place where the divine needs the creation in order to realize itself. And, I think that other forms of Gnosticism perhaps struggle to explain why there was creation at all. For example, was it a mistake? Was it, dark from the beginning? But I think in Hermeticism, you still have this hint of, connection. And so Yeah, I think we could certainly discuss it. But I do think you had a lot of elements of sort of darkness and evil flesh that got into theosophy through some Hermetic texts. And those were, elements that I felt ended up becoming problematic. And, different modern interpreters have tried to take it in, different directions. I mean, even people who are interpreting the Course in Miracles today have different ideas about, how to live in a world that's not real, whether one should try to improve a world that's not real. And, when I look at the April Laconic in her book, The Gnostic New Age, I mean, she sort of argues that there were, 5 major components of ancient Gnosticism that she sees analogs to in contemporary Gnosticism. And she's really focusing on this direct experiential approach to the divine, to the transcendent God, and also the rituals and the choreography that, seem to get separated from people's ideas about what Gnosticism was. I mean, many people see it as this sort of cerebral thing. And I like that April has tried to kind of resurrect those rituals and the songs, because it supports the notion that the ancient Gnostics believed that you sort of had to rehearse or practice for your ultimate divine transformation, and that they also had a therapeutic component, which I see the therapeutic starts to get stronger and stronger in the contemporary systems, and they start to become less concerned with the future, the other world, the escape from the body.
Well said, and I agree. I love April's work, and it must be a challenge, for example, to you who likes to study modern religions and cults, and you're sort of looking at the Gnostic themes there, among other themes. Is there sort of a decision when you say this modern group is Gnostic, or is it simply, well, they were influenced by Gnosticism? Is there a paradigm or a rubrics today?
That's an excellent question. I think that we heard from sort of the one contemporary group, Stephen Heller's group, that Ecclesia Gnostica, that actually, models itself consciously on ancient Gnosticism and really engages with it. I feel that most of the other groups that call themselves Gnostics, or that who say that the Gnostics sort of really had the true teaching or the best ideas, those groups tend to kind of pick and choose. They really cherry pick the specific texts that seem to speak to their theological orientation. And, there's obviously a lot of overlap between Gnostic ideas and Neoplatonist ideas and even some Christian ideas. And there are a lot of groups that had a Christian orientation. And of course, you had ancient Christian Gnostics, and you had ancient Gnostics who did not identify as Christian. So there's a whole body of work that has grown up around, contemporary Christian Gnostic themes, I suppose. And you could certainly find them in New Thought, for example. And I think one of the most beautiful things that my parents did, they created rituals that appeal to people today who generally sort of feel like perhaps they're strangers or aliens in the world, and that they would like to live in a world that was more transcendent. And my father wrote some prayers that allow people to engage in sort of a personal transformation to become like Christ. And so those are used by people who are not even in their church. And I think that, they fill a spiritual need that people are expressing today who are simply just not satisfied with institutionalized Christianity. And I think that was also one of the big appeals of Helena Blavatsky's work. I mean, her book, Isis Unveiled, which became a bestseller in 1875, 1877, when it was first published, she spends all kinds of time criticizing the, institutionalized Christianity for being, for being bloody, for being superstitious. And, this is where she starts to create this narrative that the Gnostics had the true Christianity. And so, I can see why that was so appealing in late 19th and early 20th century America. And I can see why there were so many different groups that kind of built off of her work.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, and I think what we see, and of course, let me know if you agree, Erin, but yes, these groups see sort of this, like you said, the true Christianity, and their views are in line with what they think. For example, reincarnation, more direct experience, maybe some are libertine, that's why we have the Gnostic Mass at the OTO and so forth. But
right.
So they're going, well, this is the true Christianity. But again, we can go back to April DeConnick and the Gnostic New Age, which is kind of a Bible for me because it's the latest and it has the cutting edge and the reasons you have brought up. But like April says, they're not entirely right because, again, April did say this, Gnostic texts didn't become heretical. They were heretical. They were already against the grain of all pretty much movements of ancient times.
Right. And I think that's part of why the Gnostics, had their sort of inner circle teachings and their secret teachings, because they were at the same time competing with what you would call the proto-Orthodox movement. And they were sort of drawing from the same pool of, mostly of people who were curious about Judaism, Hebrew Bible, who were also interested in Neoplatonism, and who were looking for new ways to approach salvation.
At the same time, again, the Gnostics were controversial because they said, well, the gods and the spirits are really not all that they should be. Neither is their governments. And even more, we can be higher than the gods. So that's not something that went well. And I think a lot of modern movements might have missed it to an extent. But just out of curiosity, I'd like to ask a lot, I guess, you're fine with the term Gnosticism as it is? Because, of course, I'm sure you've read Elaine Pagels and Karen King, and they're like, it's maybe not a useful term. They should just be alternative Christians. What do you think, Erin?
Well, I'm certainly not a scholar of ancient Gnosticism, but I think that if people choose to use a word to describe themselves and to describe a certain sensibility, then I think that they should be able to do that. I mean, to me, gnosis is a word that's almost a little bit like psyche, like nous, like, reason and intellect, which get taken philosophically in so many different directions. And I think you look at, you can have a scholar like Harold Bloom who claims that, America is a Gnostic country, a Gnostic nation.
Everything's not Shakespeare's Gnostic.
Yeah, so
stretches that.
I mean, if I think broadly, loosely, when most people, if they hear the word Gnostic, they either think it means a sort of radical dualist position, or they think it means a self-divinization. I think those are, those kind of have equal camps, and some people think it means both. And, some people, and I also think obviously Orthodox theologians have tried to define themselves as not Gnostic, and Gnostics as being the heretics. And so I think that it's going to continue to be useful. We know that in the ancient world and the people who influenced, for example, St. Paul, there was always this discussion about, whether it was a good thing to develop knowledge, whether knowledge was a good thing. And you have a lot of discussion even in the New Testament about knowledge and wisdom. And so to the extent that gnosis is kind of riffing off of that, you can see that people could develop a sort of Christian style Gnosticism that might have just kind of snipped off the bits that they didn't like, that they didn't appreciate so much. And I think that April does a pretty good job of explaining sort of why and how that could happen. And, you know, another paper that she wrote that I was quite impressed with is her, you know, she says it's important not to neglect the sociological context of the Gnostic groups. And she talks about how some of them tried to align themselves with the dominant Roman culture, and those were the ones that tended to survive, and that the ones that were too antinomian tended to not survive. And so I think that it's important to look at how social conditions can influence doctrines, even though many people would say that doctrine should be, you know, should be isolated and pure in some way, but I don't really think that's the case.
No, not at all. And how did your mom use the Gnostic Gospels or the Nag Hammadi library to help her out or crystallize her viewpoints when you were growing up?
Well, it's interesting because she sort of, you know, there were always Gnostic, for want of a better word, influences in the theology, which was drawn primarily from both Theosophy and the I Am religious movement, which was a kind of proto-New Age movement that was popular in the 1920s and 30s that also had some roots in New Thought. And so you had sort of multiple streams that combined in my parents' work. And, you know, one of the most recognizable, you might say, it could be construed as a Gnostic icon. They have this image, which is called the chart of the presence, your divine self. And it's supposed to indicate an individual sort of standing beneath a Christ figure, and then above the Christ figure is a divine figure that is supposed to represent a transcendent Father, Mother, God, you know. And so the idea is that you were supposed to come into congruence with the third part of this Trinity, and that when that happened, that you would be transformed, and your soul would be fused with the divine, and that you would go on to experience life in sort of other dimensions. And so this icon, this chart of your quote real self, or the chart of the presence, it achieved a pretty wide following, even among people who are not in their church, and because I think it sort of depicts what people imagine their sort of divine anatomy might be. And I think you can see parallels in Gnostic Gospels with this notion of sort of the Christ, or the bridal chamber, and all. So all of that imagery was taken into their theology and expanded upon. And I think that, when my father was alive, he only had and he died in 1973, he only had the Blavatsky's writings and maybe some of the other work that was done, that was just based on the Hippolytus, the Church Fathers version of Gnosticism. But then when Elaine Pagel's Gnostic Gospels came out in the 80s, my mother was reading it and she said, "Oh, this is what we've been teaching all along," like this is, confirming the truth of everything we've been teaching. And so she began to give sort of formal structured interpretations of Gnostic texts. And this went on for the rest of her career. And as, new texts would be published. But there wasn't really, as I said, a lot of focus on consistency. And I think it was always assumed that the Gnostics sort of agreed with one another and that there was a consistent message. So that was where I started, as I mentioned, having questions. But I think, my parents, if you want to say this, they developed this really very structured set of exercises by which people were supposed to be able to overcome the evil of the material world and, join their transcendent divine self. And so I think that there, if you want to get into talking about the Archons, there were certainly a lot of ideas about how the human could be influenced by various evil spirits. And there are a lot of prayers and rituals in their work that were designed to protect, to create sort of walls of light around an individual, to prevent any evil forces from getting in, etc. And I think that my mother even also taught about, for example, the Zachariah Sitchin Nephilim hypothesis. Yes. So that the UFOs were involved. So there's a pretty well-developed theology of evil that also used the book of Enoch, for example, and fallen angels. But I think it was always from a very Christian-oriented context, and probably didn't directly engage. But she thought that the Apocryphon of John, she taught that was sort of the highest and the most wonderful of the Gnostic Gospels.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
It's a very, I would say it's one of the central ones. And it's interesting, too, because Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels doesn't even mention the Archons once. I have criticism. I think it's a groundbreaking book, but I think on scholarship, it just falls short in many ways. But again, a very important book. But what about in Gnosticism, there is sort of the idea or the pushing of the divine feminine, as enigmatic and mysterious as she can be, whether it's Sophia, Barbelo, and of course there's Mary Magdalene. Did that influence your mother? She did write the book, The Divine Feminine and Mary Magdalene.
Yes, well, absolutely. I also have an article, which I'll just give a little plug for, which is called Elizabeth Clare Prophet, Gender, Sexuality, and the Divine Feminine, which came out in a volume that is called Female Leaders of New Religious Movements. So some of your listeners might be interested to look at that article, because I try to address, in many ways, my mother was, pushed a message that could be seen as very supportive of women and of women's roles in religion. And she always, taught a father, mother, God. And she thought that she preached against, for example, priestly celibacy. She thought that women should be allowed to preach. She herself, obviously, a strong female leader. But she also was very much against abortion. She was against the Equal Rights Amendment and other things that people might have thought, that a woman would support. And obviously, a person's position on abortion is can never be fully predicted by their, position on the role of women in society. But I try to unpack that a little bit in my article that I've just published. But I would definitely say that my mother's work, she also published many people call it a forgery, Nicholas Notovich, Lost Years of Jesus book. That was probably her best-selling title. And it basically argues that Jesus went to India and studied Indian religion. And there's a passage in it which I think was actually probably written by Nicholas Roerich. I don't know if you're familiar with Nicholas Roerich.
No.
But Nicholas and Helena Roerich were Russians who studied theosophy and who began basically producing writings from masters. That's we can go into that if you want. In the theosophical tradition, the masters are seen as sort of people who have transcended Earth but are still sort of hanging around to help out. And so the Roriks had written this sort of legend about the role of women that begins with the phrase "reverence woman, for she is the mother." And it's Rorik painted this beautiful painting called "The Mother of the World," which shows a female figure seated with a veil over her face that is quite luminescent. He did a lot of artwork. There's actually a museum in New York that's devoted to his work. But my mother, built upon the Rorik's work on women and the divine feminine. And she also lectured extensively about Sophia and about the role of Mary Magdalene. And, even though she was fairly conservative about sexuality, she believed that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married and had children. So she kind of bought into that whole theory. And she believed that it was part of her mission in life to help women to not feel guilty about sexuality, believe it or not, even though she ultimately thought that sexuality was something to be transcended. So I think she realized that the Gnostics had different positions about sexuality, and definitely from the Theosophical Society, we inherited the idea that sexuality was something that would tie you to the world, and that sexuality was something that ultimately should be transcended. But I think that unlike some other groups, even the IM, we certainly believe that it was important to have children and to raise them well and things like that.
Well said. And what do you think these ideas, or we might have just answered this question, but why do you think Gnostic ideas or the Nag Hammadi library is so, it interests New Agers and individuals in the New Thought? Is it because, again, like we talked about, the idea of equality with women, reincarnation, and all that? From your view, what do you think, Erin?
I think that it appeals to contemporary spiritual seekers for a whole lot of reasons. Yeah, I think it's the the focus on individual spirituality and the goal of life being to emulate the Savior rather than to be a helpless, someone that needed to be saved. But I can remember a lecture that my mother gave on the Hymn of the Pearl. And there were, people who felt profoundly touched by the Hymn of the Pearl, which is talking about this king and sending his son into a far country. And, the son falls asleep and then is recovered. It's just this sort of, notion that we all are here and we're asleep. And it kind of also reflects well with the Buddhist sensibility, right? That we're asleep and then we just need to wake up and remember who we are, that we're all royal, that we're all princes, and that we are meant to return sort of in triumph to our divine parents. I mean, that's a wonderful story. It's a
beautiful poem.
Yeah.
Right. Wonderful. And Vance, do you have any questions for Erin?
Yeah, Erin. It's kind of surprises me, being that your mother was into Gnosticism and so forth, that it seems, according to at least what leaks out on the outside, that she seemed to be a very authoritarian person and didn't really share the spiritual leadership with the rest of the church. Is that a misnomer, or is that the way it was? And how do you reconcile that with the ideas of, the Gnostics, who we always think of as more unorthodox?
That's a really good question, Vance. I think that all New Age spirituality has an innate tension between the notion that God is within and that we need to, develop our divine presence, our divine reality, and the notion that we are ignorant and that we need to have our eyes open, and that perhaps that there are people other than ourselves who have more insight than we do. And I think if you go back and you read some, especially at least from the heresiologist perspective, there were a lot of schisms between Gnostic teachers. And
oh yeah,
they were they, as soon as you have the idea that anyone can sort of talk to God, then the question becomes, does God say the same thing to everyone? And if not, how do you know whose version is correct?
God always agrees with me, right?
Yeah, me too.
So, I mean, you have these issues. And so the way my mother tried to resolve it was to say, look, you can, communicate or commune with the masters and divine beings about your personal life and your family and what you choose to do. But when it comes to the group and what's accepted theology or what the group is going to do, I am the only one that's giving officially sanctioned information. And so it wasn't just my mother who had this problem. It was a problem in the IM before her, where there were people that started getting their own messages from divine beings and from masters, and they constantly had to be sanctioned or removed from the group. And it's funny because, one of the things I study is the sociology of new religious movements. And, if you don't have some kind of control on inspiration, on who's allowed to change the theology and change the way the group does things, then you're going to end up with either a very small group or a group that needs to be structured along different lines, And one of the reasons why I left my mother's group was because I felt that we needed a better system of governance that wasn't predicated on the idea that only one person could receive official direction from God. And so I'm much in favor of, developing new forms of spiritual organization. And I haven't quite figured out what the best way is. You have a lot of sort of destructured groups like, 12-step groups or study groups.
Right.
And, my father originally started this group. He didn't intend to start a church. He was trying to start this sort of worldwide network, prayer network, basically, that he was going to send out lessons to, and everyone would sort of meditate at the same time every week on some kind of world peace or something. And eventually it ended up becoming a church through rituals. And so, I think in some cases my mother was a victim of the mythology that surrounded her, because everyone was sort of looking to her for answers, and I think it was difficult for her to be in that position. And certainly if you look at the Theosophical Society, they had multiple schisms based on these very similar lines of who has the authority and how can we tell who has the authority. And then it starts getting into questions of personal behavior. Is the person drinking alcohol? Are they smoking? What do they eat? Meat, things like that. If they're eating meat, then they can't possibly be communicating with God. So, I think that there are a lot of reasons why people choose to follow leaders, or why they choose to believe that one person has authority and another person doesn't. And, both of my parents were charismatic leaders and, produced quite a bit of material. Whatever anyone might say about their behavior, there certainly were things to critique about their behavior and the way they treated people. So I guess my conclusion is that most of the leaders of the past didn't have the kind of scrutiny that's available to us now, that we can record everything. And I think that there were definitely things that they did that I didn't agree with, and I hope that people are able to take their ideas and turn them into something better.
And it should be mentioned too, because this is sort of the elephant in the room when you talk about Gnosticism,
Yes.
and that's the truth that they were elitists, very elitist. We had the knowledge, and everybody else was asleep at the wheel. And isn't that pretty much is that pretty much in every religion or New Age religion, Erin?
Well, I think it comes along to greater or lesser degrees. I mean, I think that my parents preached a message of, global salvation, and that everyone, all mankind was the term they used, were meant to be sort of lifted up through their teachings. But at the same time, they also had sort of secret inner teachings, and it was thought that perhaps all of humans might have to continue to reincarnate. And you get into this with Blavatsky's work as well. I mean, she started out by saying that only elite people would be allowed to reincarnate, and then only on a higher sphere. That was sort of one of the forms of salvation that she promoted early on. And she was trying to sort of blend together different ideas from Hermeticism and Kabbalah. But she ultimately, in the end, kind of moved towards much more of a universal salvation idea because of a lot of reasons. And so I think that groups may promote universal salvation at different times in their history. And for my parents, they began to get into apocalyptic ideas, and then it sort of became, well, perhaps it's only a remnant that's going to be saved. Perhaps it's only this small group that, the mature, right? You can take that from the Bible too. Some Christians are only able to drink milk, and the others can eat the strong meat. So the idea is that those who are awake, those who are mature, those who have wisdom, who have their eyes opened. I mean, the Bible's fairly elitist on these points as well.
Yes, indeed.
Is that somehow they're the ones that are really going to receive the favor, or really going to survive or be saved. I think that through reincarnation, some of the theosophical systems sort of allow that everybody is eventually going to make their way to their, transformation and divine oneness, but it might take them a few extra million years.
It's like we're all one, but some people are oner than others, right?
Exactly. Well said.
Yes, and you mentioned, interesting, Erin, that was my next question, is about the apocalypse. And of course, the Gnostics were certainly into their apocalypses. They made up so many of them. And even you talk about the secret book of John, Jesus saying, well, this is what's going to happen to these people and those people. And like your church, you start reading some of the later ones, like on the origin of the world, they're getting more and more universalist. And I don't know why they're doing it. Are they softening up? Are they maturing? They're less edgy. They're not as edgy as when religions start. But why do you think even modern cults, what's the idea of an apocalypse? Is that something that people hope for? Is it a way to control the flock? Is it just sexy fiction? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think that the word cult is used in a lot of different senses, just like Gnostic or any other term. And I think what many people mean today when they say cult is a small, unpopular group that's in some kind of state of tension with the surrounding society. And I think if you start to look at some of the apocalyptic groups, and let's remember that apocalypse to begin with just means vision or revelation, but it came to be associated with some kind of radical transformation and or ending of the established order, and often in some kind of supernatural way, largely because of the book of Revelation. And so you can see that many that some of if you look deeply into a number of apocalyptic episodes that have happened around cults, you would often find that it came to a head when the group was feeling that it was delegitimized in some way, and or that the leader was struggling with some kind of a crisis of confidence with the membership, or some kind of difficulty with achieving some kind of new success or some kind of predicted success. So with our group, I mean, my mother was pretty well educated, and so were her followers, and they were by no means biblical literalists. But both of my parents had developed concerns about sort of collective karma or world karma, which is another concept that came right out of Theosophy. And the notion was that a country, a nation could build up so much karma that it would experience some kind of cataclysm. And, you know, Blavatsky worked a lot with the myth of Atlantis. And so it was updated, and you had books like, for example, Philos the Tibetan. I don't know if you've seen that, A Dweller on Two Planets by Philos the Tibetan.
No, I haven't.
It's a channeled work that was published in the late 19th century, and it builds on theosophical themes, and it tells this whole story. It's set in California, actually, and in Mount Shasta. And it's one of the texts that sort of was inaugurated this development of this idea that America was some kind of refuge, and the mountains of America were some kind of refuge that where, you know, souls might wait out some cataclysmic destruction. And it was Blavatsky that promoted the idea that at the end of every sort of period of what she called evolution or root races, that sort of every few million years or so, there would be this upheaval, geological upheaval, and one continent would fall and the other one would rise. And so there's this whole mythos and mystique about the sort of northwestern United States, that it's somehow a refuge and a place where people could survive this transformation. And so various New Age teachers have proposed that we're in this transition period and that some kind of radical shift is going to happen. Obviously, it always ends up being within our lifetimes, right?
Of course.
Because otherwise it wouldn't serve as much of a call to action.
Right.
We are at the end of the interview. For the audience, if you're interested in following Erin and her work, please go to eprofit.info. We will have a link in the show notes, but we are at the end of the interview. First of all, Vance, thanks for being with us on this journey, this wonderful journey.
Oh, yeah, it was so delightful. Thank you so much, Erin. It was a delight to be able to converse with you.
Thank you. I loved it. It was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we hope to have you on soon.
Okay.
And there you have it, my beloved Truth Seeker warriors. The first part of a great interview with Erin Prophet. So glad she's on the side of Gnosis. She is, and she's gonna kick so much egregore ass. In our second part, Erin continues to discuss her ideas on the psychology of apocalypses, as well as her own personal views on climate change. She discusses, too, her own ideas on UFOs, and more on neo-Gnostic culture. Erin talks about the concept of the perennial philosophy, while I decide to share about my short stint as a born-again Christian. We talk about our favorite movies about cults, and then Erin shares what her life is like as a scholar and away from the Church Universal and Triumphant. And has she had any mystic experiences in her life? And much more. Don't miss it if you want to eventually get out of the desert of the real like Erin did. Just become an AB Prime member or patron at Patreon. A mere $5.99 a lunar cycle, or really whatever you want to pledge a month on Patreon. Damning your soul has never been this cheap, but you'll get your spirit back. Your support helps keep growing this Red Pill cafeteria and a growing Gnostic community you can be part of. Please go to thegodabovegod.com for how to get this and all other full shows, as well as other wonderful bonuses. If you just want to support with shekels via PayPal or the US mail, head on to my homepage as well, or just message me. I can't do this without you, and we're all in this together. Those of us waking up and letting go of all that programming. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being yourself, your true self, here in the desert of the real. Hello and goodbye as always.